Hello, and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to Travel Tales from Beyond the Brochure, a podcast looking at unfamiliar places across the world and aspects of travelling you may never have thought of. I'm your host, the Barefoot Backpacker, a middle-aged enby with a passion for offbeat travel, history, culture, and the whys behind travel itself. So join with me as we venture beyond the brochure. Hello. Not a great deal has happened in the last fortnight, certainly nothing that's really of any significance to talk about in the introduction to this podcast episode. It is getting to the stage of the year where my weekly running group are using head torches. We didn't need them too much on last week's run because we were mainly running on canals and suburban roads, but in a couple of weeks' time it'll be dusk at the start of the run, never mind the middle, and that's before the clocks go back at the end of the month. Our Christmas tree is still up and still providing multicoloured joy in a drab world. And it is a drab world. But we all need to do what we can to give ourselves as much joy as we're able. It's hard to fight for other people if you find it difficult to fight for yourself, after all, and we all need to be as strong as we can be. I had a friend visiting me a couple of weeks ago. My old friend Alistair. I've been trying to get him to visit for a while, but he's about as tricky to get to commit as I am, arguably for similar reasons. He's been a guest on this podcast a couple of times. I did fully intend to get him to record some things for a future episode while he was here, but, well, we didn't. Because we were distracted. Mainly by beer. Who knew? In related news, Laura has now finally had the Pabst Blue Ribbon that's on tap at the Micro Pub in Todmorden and can confirm it is exactly as she remembers. This is neither a compliment nor an insult. Nostalgia definitely affects the way we approach things, especially foods and drinks. It's not going to be many people's favourite beer, though. My paid day job might be getting more interesting. I've sometimes mentioned in passing that my role isn't the most fulfilling in the world, and while that sounds like a slight on my workplace, I need you to be under no illusions about this. They are fully aware of my thoughts and have been on the receiving end of my rants for over 2 years. Anyway, finally, it looks like I'm being utilised to help my colleagues in another department, and this will, as a sideline, enable me to use tools and products around website analytics and SEO that, let's be honest, might come in very useful in my travel blogging sideline. SEO is one of those topics that comes up a lot in blogger conferences, but no one can really face it when the workshops are scheduled for 9 a.m. on a Sunday morning. And the average travel blogger is not a data analyst. A better question is, can I maintain my focus and interest long enough to do anything about it? On that note, I've still not done what I need to do in order to get ADHD medication. It's on my list. Quite a few things are on my list. Some of them are time sensitive. There is a certain irony to all of this, and one that ADHDers, which needs a better descriptive word, know only too well. I notice it was also World Mental Health Day last week. I've spoken about that kind of thing before on a couple of dedicated podcast episodes, and it's not something I'm going to mention again now, except that I'm in the middle of an interesting conversation with my therapist about repressed emotions and how it is that I really get excited about things, and I'm mentioning that here because it seems apt when you're doing a podcast about somewhere that is effectively someone else's bucket list, but when asked about your trip, all I can respond is, yeah, it was okay. And it was okay, as you'll now hear. So, one might ask, why is a non-swimming, easily bored, less than aesthetic enby with Celtic skin and all the sun resistance that doesn't entail spending 2 weeks in the Caribbean? Wasn't 4 days in Maldives enough to satisfy the tropical beach itch? Apparently not. There were actually several different concepts at play here that meant this was an obvious trip to take. The most pressing, of course, the aeroplane in the room as it were, was the whole 100 countries in 50 years thing. The Caribbean is in principle an easy way to knock off several countries from the list in quick time, given that they're all quite small, relatively close to each other. In fact, this was slightly trickier than it sounded, logistically, but I will come on to why in a moment. Regardless, with a bit of planning and foresight, it was a much simpler chance to advance quicker to my target than, say, 2 weeks in East Africa. Not that it was an entirely country-counting exercise, because if I'd wanted to do that, I'd have just taken long weekends to Algiers and Nouakchott. The Caribbean isn't a part of the world I knew a lot about, and I'll be honest, I never really looked into. Partly, this is because in my head, they were as I have said on many occasions, a series of small hot islands full of honeymooners, and it never occurred to me that I'd want to go there. Even if I had looked into them more, I think they'd have been the sort of place I wouldn't necessarily have thought to go to on my own because I'd be worried I'd get a bit bored. Enter Laura. As you all know, my friend and common travel companion is American. You'd have thought, as an American, she would have known much more about the Caribbean than I did, given that, they're right there, and Americans visit that part of the world in the same way we in the UK tend to visit the likes of Spain and Greece. You'd have thought that, but you'd have been wrong. Laura's quite willing to admit it was almost embarrassing to have been all around the world but never set much foot in her own backyard, aside from one cruise many years ago that focused more on the Central American coast than the islands anyway. So when we looked into the possibility of doing a trip that way, she felt it was kind of about time that she went there. Another thing that drew her to the Caribbean for this trip, as opposed to anywhere else in the world, was that St. Lucia had been on her bucket list for quite some time, so she was more than keen to grab the opportunity while it was available. That said, she always imagined going with a boyfriend or a lover, or at the very least, someone who could swim. Another factor, though, in our decision was that we'd been to Maldives earlier in the year, and Laura was still hankering after a decent beach trip. For me, I figured it would also be interesting to compare and contrast with a different kind of tropical destination, a whole style of trip I still have very little experience of, and which is slightly outside my comfort zone as a result. In addition, there was also the thought of, like Maldives, the Caribbean is generally a place you go to for resort holidays, but here with the additional option of cruises. Who listening hasn't got in their mind right now a 2-week cruise popping by some of the lovelier islands and Haiti for excursions or overnights in exclusive walled compounds surrounded by retired white people? As an aside though, there is a cruise on offer called Honky Tonk and Hoedowns that's 2 nights in Nashville, 1 full day at Dolly World, and then 6 nights cruising to the Bahamas, Puerto Rico and the US Virgin Islands. Honestly, it's tempting. I've never worn cowboy boots in my life, but life is too short to be beige. But our Caribbean trip would, of course, not be like that. We were interested to see if it were even possible to travel independently, slowly and locally through the region the way that most holidaymakers don't, because we're trendsetters and on a budget. However, the fundamental premise was one of our early planning nightmares. Because so few people travel the Caribbean independently, or rather, because so few people travel independently to multiple destinations rather than staying put on one island for a week, we had a bit of trouble with inter-island transportation. For example, there was an infrequent ferry service between Grenada and one of the islands in the Grenadine archipelago. However, a hurricane a few years ago knocked out one of the ships. A second ship was sourced, which itself got knocked out in the hurricanes the following year, and to the best of our research, has never been replaced. The problem we had here was a combination of a lack of previous travellers having done these journeys, coupled with a whole myriad of companies and contact information which was severely outdated. One ferry company I found online had a website whose last timetable update was in January 2020. Optimistic. Another suggested contacting one country's national ferry board, only to find that their official email addresses were refusing all mail. Only one company seemed to offer any kind of international services at all, l'Express des Îles, which, as you can infer from their name, are based in the French Overseas Department of Guadeloupe, which, as a French Overseas Department, doesn't count for country counting purposes. They do, however, serve St. Lucia, which helped. The only problem with them was that for reasons that we couldn't ascertain, no ferries were operating at all during our second planned week there, which meant if we wanted to take their routes, we'd have to spend less time in St. Lucia than Laura would have liked. Although plenty of ferries exist domestically, especially within larger groups like the Grenadines, the reason there are so few international ferry services is geographic. Stiff breezes with rough waves, occasional hurricanes, infrastructure issues, and a low population — St. Lucia's population is around 178,000, and that makes it one of the larger ones — means that demand for international ferry services is surprisingly low. A couple of companies have apparently tried in the past to connect more islands, but they've never been profitable. Interestingly, while there's a decent air network covered by several operators, there's no low-cost options, so the price per kilometre is relatively high. Not that the boats themselves are cheap, both of ours were around €79 one way, but flights would have been a shade less than double that. So, given that, as I say, St. Lucia was a non-negotiable, the question was, should we head south or north? Going south would take us to the remote tropical beaches of St. Vincent and the Grenadines and the quite picturesque sounding island of Grenada, though it would have to be done by some short flights in potentially very small aeroplanes, while going north would take us to the French outpost of Martinique and the lesser attested island Dominica, not to be confused with the Dominican Republic. This could be done by ferry, but Martinique wasn't exactly enticing. In the end, what swung it was a combination of cost, logistics, and weather. We were going in early June, which is kind of the very back end of the tourist season. This is because officially the hurricane season starts on the 1st of June. Obviously the natural world doesn't care about arbitrary dates created by human culture, but we'd be there for 2 weeks, and obviously the later in the trip we got, the more likely hurricanes would be to form. Previous hurricanes had affected the south much more than the north. Indeed, a couple of islands in the Grenadines were still nowhere near recovered from ones that hit in 2021 and 2022. Laura's aversion to flights, especially on small planes in bad weather, meant that she'd rather take the ferry anyway. For reasons of cost and convenience, our trips would end in Barbados, because there was a direct flight from there back to London, but getting there would involve one flight at least from wherever we ended up. So we decided that one regional flight was enough, and that we should head north. The actual trip wasn't as expensive as I'd feared, in the sense that I was expecting tropical beach destinations to have tropical beach prices, and in the main, they didn't. I mean, it's obviously not as budgeted as somewhere like the tropical beaches of Philippines or Thailand, but equally hotel and food prices weren't going to break your bank if you were coming from a generically expensive country. The public transport options weren't frequent or regular, but, aside from a couple of instances, I shall hear, they did exist, and it's definitely possible to go to most places using local buses. It just takes a bit of planning. And avoid trying to travel on Sundays and bank holidays completely. Though that's not astoundingly different from much of the UK, to be honest. With regards to accommodation, as in a few other places we'd travelled, the trickiest issue we had was finding twin-bedded rooms. When I browsed on a notable hotel booking site, not saying which one, but I've already said it, there were many options for our dates in St. Lucia and Dominica, until I specified twin-bedded rooms. St. Lucia dropped to about 5 or 6 across the entire island for the bulk of our stay, and for our one night in the city of Castrios specifically, the only 2 places that were either convenient or budgetary had ratings that even the Britannia hotel chain in the UK would have sneered at. In Dominica, absolutely nothing came up at all in Roseau, and all of our options were a bit remote. This ended up being a good thing, but it wasn't my intention. Laura would absolutely have been best off going with a lover rather than a bestie. People have joked that we should just get married out of the sheer convenience for this sort of thing, missing the point that we'd still need twin beds. I would do anything for love, but I won't do that. Our expectations for the trip weren't extensive. Indeed, one of our fears was that we'd not have that much to do. We very much had it down as a trip to chill rather than one to be active. It was just a case of wondering if we'd get too chill and kind of feel it a bit of a waste. Certainly when I was plotting a trip, I'd made a note of pretty much everything there was to do on every island south of Dominica, and it wasn't a terribly long list. But on the other hand, as long as there were beaches, and as long as there was a room, everything else would be a bonus. Right? I have little memory of my journey to the Caribbean. I can tell you we flew out of London Gatwick, which meant that I had to come down the afternoon before and take a long train journey to the obscurely named town of Salfords, not to be confused with Salford, which is a different place entirely, although they both mean ford by the willow trees. Salfords is in Surrey, so it's quite well to do, although I got there late enough that the gastropub attached to the slightly small and less well-endowed Premier Inn had stopped serving food for the evening. Waiting several minutes to check in, as the receptionist was in a different time zone, wasn't an issue. My room was on the ground floor, which doesn't happen very often, and looked out onto a narrow section of grass and a fence, which is underwhelming but infinitely more aesthetic than usual. I often post to my YouTube stories about my views from hotel windows, and they're exactly as you'd expect from budget travel. I met Laura in the check-in queue at the airport the next morning. She likes to get to airports early, so I grudgingly eased out of bed and took the bus rather than walked. We eventually made our way to the Wetherspoons because there's nothing like a Wetherspoons breakfast, especially at an airport, and it ensured Laura could lubricate her mind to face the horrors of the next few hours in the air. Airports are very liminal places, both in time and in space, so my usual rules of no beer before midday tend not to apply. I also took the opportunity to draw out some more cash from an ATM. I'd already got a couple of £100, but I'd procrastinated on obtaining US dollars. The ATM in Gatwick dispensed dollars directly, so even at a ridiculously poor exchange rate, I still felt that it was useful. Spoiler alert, it became even more useful than I'd intended. 9 hours in the air in a noticeably half-empty plane, and we were in St. Lucia, country 97 for me, and not a place I'd have expected to visit. It took a while to get in. We were one of the last to leave the plane in the first place, and then we got held up at the immigration desks because the border guard requested information about where we were staying, and didn't quite seem to understand the concept of, yeah, it's not a hotel, it's someone's flat. No, it doesn't have a specific name. No, we communicated through email. Why would I know their telephone number? This was not helped by the airport not having Wi-Fi, so getting access to the information they required wasn't quick or easy. Tip for travellers, make sure you have every single possible relevant information related to your accommodation, not just the booking confirmation itself, and the address. We were eventually allowed to enter the country, and we had time to kill, so we took a walk to the condo. The road does a curve alongside the airport, turning back on itself on the far side of the runway, and goes for a mile or two with the airport on one side and the sea on the other. You'd have thought this would make it a really nice and aesthetic beachy setting to amble, watching planes land on one side and the wind shaking the palm trees on the other. Listener, it was not. Now, I'm not saying it was grim or anything, but not many flights serviced the airport, especially slightly off-season, so the runway felt a bit dead with only our plane headed on elsewhere. Trinidad, maybe. Certainly quite a few people stayed on board when we alighted. While on the other side there was sand, but it was quite narrow, felt quite forlorn, and covered with sargassum and palm fronds. It felt quite bleak, as beaches go, not really that enticing. Possibly not what you might have expected from somewhere like St. Lucia, but conversely, we were only an hour in, and we had a whole island to explore. Our accommodation for 2 nights was on the upper floor of a small apartment block on a side street in the town of Vieux-Fort. The apartment itself was fine. Roof terrace, little balcony, aircon to freeze your fingers off, a shower that worked fine. It's just that Vieux-Fort is a largely functional area, and it's not pretty, let's be honest. It's a bit light grey and scruffy, with very cuboid buildings and unkempt streets. It's a place where people live, not where people go. It's apparently also got the highest crime rate in St. Lucia, but we never saw any of that. What we did see was the inside of a KFC, because it was close by, it was open, and we were tired, so it was easy. We did have problems paying for it because my card kept being refused, but I figured that would be a problem for future Nell. We paid in cash in US dollars instead, as it seems they're accepted across much of the country at a fixed exchange rate, while I'd paid for the accommodation, weirdly, in British pounds for no reason other than that I could. Again, this proved to be a good idea with hindsight. Our first night saw comfortably long sleep, despite the incredibly loud music being played from a bar just below our rooms, although even being Saturday it stopped seemingly unexpected early, about 9:15 p.m. As we'd find out, St. Lucia doesn't do late nights. The reason I booked 2 nights in the Vieux-Fort area was because it seemed a sizable enough place and convenient for the airport. The main international airport in St. Lucia isn't really anywhere near anything you might deem touristy due to the topography of the island. In fact, this is something common to many islands in the region. They're small and mountainous, so there's very little flat land to build on. The settlements tend to be on the western sides, where building towns is easier and more useful, but the prevailing winds mean that the airports are much better located on the eastern side, where the weather's a bit calmer. Therefore, there's often really only 1 or 2 spots on the islands you can put an airport, and they're rarely anywhere near the main towns. In the case of St. Lucia, we just wanted somewhere easy to flop into on our first night, and we didn't want to pay for a taxi to take us halfway across the island on a Sunday, so it made sense to stick by the airport until the working week started, with more frequent and reliable buses. And this did mean our introduction to the island wasn't exactly picture perfect, and our wander along the beaches that we'd passed the previous day did nothing to change that feeling. As I say, it wasn't that they were bad. They weren't the litter-strewn, polluted, run-down beaches you might find in parts of England, but they were mostly very soft sand, slightly undulating and covered with nature. They also weren't terribly wide. The sea itself was a bit wavy too, so while nice enough to walk along in passing, they definitely weren't the sort of places you'd sit down on and spend a while. Notably, others must have felt the same way, historically. On this stretch there were very few cafes, no accommodations, and it felt a little bit deserted. We wandered past someone doing some building work on his shop and had a bit of a chat with him. He suggested we take the bus to the nearby village of Labry, and even drove us to where the main bus stop was, a very short walk from our accommodation. He promoted it by saying that in the weekdays he runs tours for tourists there, but today was his day off. It was quite refreshing to come across the opposite of a tour tout. We did query the existence of the bus, it being Sunday, but he assured us it would just mean fewer of them. We were at the bus stop for a little while, but in fairness we weren't alone, so that gave us a bit of hope. And for sure, a minibus did turn up after a while, and we were directed towards it. I say minibus. It was more like one of those large taxis or small vans that schools used to take groups on trips. There was no number or direction board on the front. The driver just shouted his destination, which does require paying attention when you're waiting, as it would be easy to miss. And of course, there's no timetables. Unlike other parts of the world, there was no waiting around until it was full. It just loaded up with a handful of people and then launched off. We paid on board with cash once we'd sat down. We were the only people going to La Bourrie. The village is at sea level down a steep hill, while the main road keeps to the cliff tops, but even so he dropped us off in the village itself. I got the impression if we hadn't been going there, he would have just driven straight along the main road and avoided the village entirely. La Bourrie is a very small place. It's pretty much just 2 roads parallel to the shorefront and several small streets cutting across, making a grid pattern. The roads were lined with colourful and varied buildings, and the beach, while quite narrow, definitely had much more Caribbean vibes with palm trees, shorefront chalets and fishing boats. There was also a pier, at the start of which people were selling fresh fish. Aside from there, it was very quiet. A few people hanging around outside one of the bars, and the occasional car passing through, but that was all. It being Sunday, not a lot was open, but we did find a place for a small lunch, grilled pork and fish with plantain. It evidently caters to tourists in the high season, being one of those places whose walls are decorated with flags, banners, posters and trinkets related to the island that are all available to buy. Now, as it turned out, there's apparently no buses back from La Bourrie on a Sunday afternoon. Well, there may have been from up the hill, but not that come down into the village itself. We ended up paying the cafe owner to give us a lift back to Vieux Fort. It's not far, only maybe 15 minutes down the road, but leaving aside the hill, the main road didn't have a pavement, merely a wide grassy verge and some sharp hidden bends, so we felt a taxi was the safer choice. But that was an option, coupled with the chap giving us a lift to the outward bus stop in the first place, suggested to us St. Lucia seems to be full of very friendly people. This would become a theme. Back in Vieux Fort, we popped into a supermarket and bought some very unripe mangoes. We didn't know how unripe they were until we tried eating them. I also tried to withdraw money from an ATM, but the first one didn't accept foreign bank cards and the second one didn't accept mine in particular. Once again, present Nell pushed this problem onto future Nell. Hello! It's time for a mid-episode break. Half-time, 7th inning stretch, that sort of thing. Put the kettle on, grab a snack, get comfortable. I'm just here to remind you ways in which you can get in touch and help this podcast out. You probably know this already, but in case you don't, the best way of supporting this podcast is to join my Patreon. For as little as a pint of beer at Wetherspoons every month, you can get a shout-out on this podcast, get occasional exclusive content, and other benefits. This podcast is going places, and wouldn't you want to say you were there before it was cool? The Patreon link can be found at patreon.com/TravelTalesBeyondBrochurePod, and it's also in the show notes. The second best way is to appear on the pod yourself. If you sign up to my newsletter, you'll be able to see what episodes are being planned and see which you'd like to contribute a voice recording for. It's also a great way to keep in contact if and when the social medias undergo a lingering heat death. Newsletters should come out in the first week of each month, and sign-ups can be found at barefoot-backpacker.us14.list-manage.com/subscribe. There's another link in the show notes, in case that was a bit wordy. I'm a big fan of promoting fellow content creators and podcasters. If you've got a podcast or vlog trailer you'd like to hear featured in this spot, drop it to me and get yourself heard around the world. Now, on with the show. Our next stop was Soufrière, a small town on the west coast about an hour from Vieux Fort along the windy road that passes La Bourrie and which would be our home for the next 3 nights. Note the names here: Vieux Fort, La Bourrie, Soufrière, Castries. St. Lucia used to be a French colony, and when the British finally wrested control at the end of the Napoleonic War, they kept the place names. Soufrière has long been a town of significance on St. Lucia. Indeed, during the days of the French rule, Soufrière was the capital of the colony. When the British took over, they moved the administration to Castries in the north of the island. It's a grid pattern of very vibrant buildings of various colours, mostly 2-storey with many a fancy balcony to be seen. It's surrounded by lush forested hills, and looking down at the town from them reveals its, to use a phrase so hated by travel writers for at least 2 decades, nestled quaintly between the bottom of the hills and a wide sweeping crater-like bay. It's a very aesthetic place to while away a bit of time. St. Lucia's flag, in case you've not seen it, and to be honest, it's not one that you'd come across that often. It's quite distinctive. It's 3 stacked triangles on a sky blue background. The triangles, a small gold one superimposed on a much larger black one with a white outline, represent the 2 mountains, Petit Piton and Gros Piton, that are visible from Soufrière. Well, Petit Piton is nearer and blocks most of the view of Gros Piton, but it's there, definitely. Apparently, you can climb them, but they're quite technical and also so humid, so you'd be a sweaty mess at the end. We did not. But these 2 mountains are very much used as a symbol of the country, to the extent that even the local lager is brewed using the Piton name. And yes, I did sit at a beachfront bar holding a bottle of Piton beer with a view of Petit Piton in the background. Because I'm cheesy like that. The beer itself was mid. The setting definitely wasn't. Now, that's not to say that the beach was one of those pristine tropical beaches that St. Lucia is famous for. Despite intentions beforehand, we did not go to the best beaches on the island. In many tropical destinations, like Jamaica, the best beaches are gate-kept in resorts. This isn't quite true here. All of the beaches are public access. However, the problem is getting to them. What are reputed to be the best beaches on the island, Anse Chastenay and Anse Manim, are 3 miles from Soufrière, but only accessible either down a very undulating and narrow gravelly road, followed by a little walk beyond one of the resort hotels, a journey not conducive by foot even without the heat and humidity, or a taxi tour boat from Soufrière Pier. The boat would cost around $70. We were quoted a taxi along the road for about $50. Both of these are horrendous for a 3-mile journey, and opens the question of, well, all the beaches are public access, but are they? Are they really? Or is that just one of those letter of the law but not the spirit of the law moments? So instead we mostly went to one at the town centre. It was nice enough, even if the waves were a bit strong and the ground fell steeply, giving not much scope for the non-swimmer in me to do more than stay at the very edge. Laura had a few dips and even found a pair of sunglasses on one swim, which was just as well as she'd recently lost a pair. Other tourists, and there were a handful of them, chose to hire speedboats or similar, go snorkelling further out to sea. Clearly, I did not do that either. I just sat on a towel and listened to podcasts. It's rare I switch off for long enough to do that. It was noticeable that there were only a handful of tourists, though. The hotel we were staying in, La Ville des Pitons, was on the road heading north out of town, partway up a very steep hill, though not as far up the hill as Booking.com had indicated. It's built directly on the side of the hill and blends into the forested slopes, as it's predominantly painted green. It has several floors, though not all of them that large, and getting around it felt a bit like a rabbit warren, with the exception that much of it is open to the elements, or at least it's very airy, with the main floor containing the reception and dining area cosplaying as a huge balcony. The view from the balcony edge is stunning as it looks out over the nearby trees, so you get a sweeping vista of the rainforest, the colourful town below, the sea, and of course a direct view of the Piton. Indeed, we had a similar view from our room, which was built on 2 levels. Downstairs was the bathroom and a small kitchen and dining area, while upstairs in a kind of mezzanine were 2 large beds. The wall facing away from the hillside was basically just window, so we had a great view without even needing to leave the room. During the height of the cruise season, the hotel gets absolutely rammed, and both that large restaurant area and the Lido, a couple of stairwells away up the hill, are very popular. On our visit, we were the only guests. The kitchen was closed, and the pool was scattered with fallen leaves. In addition, the card machine wasn't working, and they didn't accept PayPal payments. That said, the owners of the hotel did also run a restaurant, Michael's at Gen Wen, in the centre of town, very close to the pier, where we could also pay the hotel bill, so we made sure we paid them a visit or 2. In fact, the owners of the hotel fell over themselves to make us feel welcome, and this included 1 free shot of local rum, Bounty, each, and discounted food at their restaurant, and a couple of free car rides. The restaurant itself was pretty nice. We had a lovely meal of curried chicken with a whole host of sides on our first full day, which we ate on the balcony overlooking the seafront. The walls were decorated with messages from previous visitors. It's definitely a popular place. We ate quite well in Soufrière, including a very nice stew from a town centre bar cafe, staffed with slightly sullen Dylan ladies. We also had like a kind of barbecued chicken there another night. There was also a slightly upmarket bar restaurant in the town centre where we had some lovely cocktails. In fact, the only problem we had with the food here was, finding it in the first place. Once the sun went down, the shutters tended to come up, and finding anywhere that was open and serving food even past 7 p.m. proved quite problematic. Evidently lunch is a more important meal of the day here than the evening meal. In addition, the bars on the beach didn't have consistent opening hours. One of them, a large hexagonal beach hut with stools at the bar, was open some, but not all, of the days we were there, and we were there midweek. This wasn't a Sunday thing. It was all slightly confusing. Aside from drinking beer on the beach and wandering the streets taking photographs of the pretty buildings, and being followed by a very friendly street dog who seemed to think I was some kind of guru, at one point it even followed us up to the hotel, we didn't do much, but then we didn't really expect to. Rainforest hiking wasn't on our hit list, and the pitons are, to be fair, quite steep. One thing we did do, though, was visit a sulphur spring spa site. Like many of the islands in this part of the Caribbean, St. Lucia is very volcanic, and actively so. Indeed, 2 famous volcanic eruptions within living memory occurred on the islands of Martinique, the next island to the north, and Montserrat, just north of Guadeloupe, both of which caused huge devastation. So there's a lot of places where mineral-rich hot water can be reached and tapped, and on St. Lucia, just south of Soufriere and near the Piton, a small open-air spa resort has been set up to take advantage of the mineral-rich hot water that runs off the volcanoes. It's set directly on the slope of the volcano, so everything feels quite rocky and barren around. It's quite touristy, noticeably so, and if memory served, it cost about $12 to enter. You can pay a bit extra and take a tour to the crater. We did not. The spa area itself is all in the open air, and on our visit there were a couple of very short but quite heavy sudden rain showers. But if you're in the pools anyway, you're already wet, so it's no big deal. There's in fact several pools to sit and walk around in, and there's no real difference between them. I suppose it's just a better vibe to have a series of similar pools rather than one big one. Pretty much all pools were the same depth, which is about 4 feet or 1.2 metres, with stone-carved benches in the water so you could sit down and be submerged to your chest. The temperature of most of the pools were around 100 Fahrenheit, 38 Celsius, and the list of regulations suggested not spending more than 10 minutes at any one time in the water. There's also a covered shelter to store your bags, clothes, etc., 3 or 4 wooden shacks that serve as changing rooms, and there's open-air showers behind the shacks. There's also several staff on hand to look after you, and, if you want, cover you in the clay that acts as a kind of exfoliant and scrub, so when you go back into the water, you get all nicely zingy and smooth. And yes, the area did smell faintly of sulphur, but honestly not strong enough for you to really notice and distract you. That said, my swimwear, lycra daisy motif crop top and leggings I'd normally wear for running, took a couple of washes back home to get all the aroma out. On our visit it was bustling, but not that full. There were a few people milling around, but there never seemed to be more than a couple of people in each pool at any one time. Occasionally a minibus load of people would wander in, but you could tell that they were all on a tour, as it was clear from the conversations they were having that they couldn't stay very long. Conversely, we must have been there for maybe an hour and a half. Our walk back to the main road, via a coconut, took us past some rainforest with views out towards the nearby hills, covered with foliage. Laura said it felt a bit Jurassic, what she imagined the world would have looked like when the dinosaurs were dominant. It was definitely a pleasant way to spend an afternoon. One final point about Soufriere. For those of you Brits of my age, you may recall a mid-80s movie called Water, a mildly satirical comedy about a Caribbean island wanting independence. It had Michael Caine. Obviously it had Michael Caine. Everything's got Michael Caine. Anyway, it had Michael Caine and Billy Connolly in it, as well as cameos by 2 Beatles and Eric Clapton. So, most of the on-location shots on that movie were filmed here, in Soufriere. And when I mentioned it to the hotel owner who gave us a lift to the Sulphur Springs, he said that not only did he remember it all being shot, but he even managed to get Michael Caine's autograph. Despite it being one of those movies I watched on repeat back when I was young enough to do that sort of thing, I guess I'd been about 13, 14 at the time, I have to say I didn't immediately recognise the town, though perhaps it's because it'd been so long since I'd seen the movie, I'd kind of forgotten some of the background setting. As for past Nell's issues with their bank card not being accepted in places you'd have expected it to be accepted in, you can tell it's an issue when me, actively choose to make a phone call, especially one from abroad. It turns out someone tried to use my card in, of all places, Brazil, so my bank had cancelled it. In addition, my bank said because they'd cancelled it, they couldn't switch it back on, for security reasons, and I'd need a new card sent out, which is not terribly helpful when you're 4,000 miles away and that's your only bank card. I was slightly irked. In this particular instance I was okay because Laura's cards still worked, and the nature of the way we travel together means one of us pays for flights and the other one pays for hotels and everything else, and we sort it all out at the end. Usually this means one of us owes the other about £70. But imagine what would have been the situation had I been travelling solo, and 3 days into a 2-week holiday where I had only a fistful of dollars and my flight back was on a completely different island. That would probably have been a large rant on Twitter and a tale picked up by the Metro newspaper. Our last day in St. Lucia was spent getting further up the coast to the city of Castries, from where we'd take an early morning ferry the next day. We wandered over to the bus station and lurked around for 10 minutes for the next minibus, but instead we ended up in someone's car. The hotel owner was headed up that way himself and popped by the bus station to see if we were waiting. We were quite surprised to see him, and again shows the level of attentiveness the hotel had. He was going up for a small business meeting in the resort town of Rodney Bay. This is completely the opposite end of the country to the international airport, on the far side of Castries even, and takes over an hour and a half from Soufrière along the winding and undulating main road. But it's where most of the tourists go. It feels a world away from the likes of Fort Vieux, with well-to-do restaurants, a large marina full of yachts, and much cleaner, brighter and wider streets. I'm sure someone with a degree in cultural studies or social history could probably write a book as to why this is. I really can't imagine. We had a wander and an ice cream while he had what he said was a casual regular chat with a deputy prime minister or someone of that ilk. He then dropped us off at our accommodation, the adapted front room of someone's house on a residential street in northern Castries, and it turned out he knew the owner of that place too. Evidently in a country that small, if you're in any way influential, you get to know most people quite well. Left to our own devices, we had a wander around Castries. It's a lot more, gritty, maybe, than Soufrière. Certainly very busy, not a lot to see and do, with mostly unaesthetic and unappealing buildings. Not as dour as Fort Vieux, but certainly not a place you'd imagine lingering long as a tourist. This might explain why we had trouble sourcing accommodation. People who don't live here use it purely as a stopover, and if you are a tourist, why would you stay here when Rodney Bay is like 10 miles up the road? As tropical paradises go, this isn't one. But then, that's not what we were there for anyway. Well, it's not what I was there for. Anyway, because it was recommended to us by our host, we grabbed fried chicken from a street stall so large Laura couldn't see over the counter. To be fair, it was pretty good chicken, and oh my, there was a lot of it. That's what we found in all of our meals in St. Lucia. The portion sizes were pretty good. We had a quite nice night, though we did have to be up uncomfortably airy. The sun had just risen and the pavements were covered in a light coating of rain. The walk to the ferry terminal went alongside the port area, definitely not sea view you'd want from the Caribbean, and despite the early hour the terminal was quite busy. That said, much of the crowd was made up of what seemed to be a primary school trip. It seems weird to know that schools can take just a field trip to another country. Mine could just about manage Wales, which doesn't count. You'd have no chance if you grew up in Luton. And so to France, which is quite a bizarre thing to say when you're 4,000 miles away in the Caribbean, but there we are. Martinique is an overseas département and region of France, which makes it legally and administratively as French as Marseille, with the slight exception that even though it's in the European Union and it uses the euro, it's not in the Schengen area. This may be something non-EU citizens need to know. It was a comfortable ferry ride, about 2 hours, and to be honest, I dozed for much of the journey. I don't recall any issues getting in, and as the ferry terminal is right in the centre of the main city, Fort-de-France, we were very quickly in the town and wandering around. We only had 2 nights in Martinique, just over 2 full days, purely and simply because our flight from Dominica to Barbados was on the following Thursday, and the way the ferries were scheduled meant that if we didn't, we'd have had 2 extra days in Dominica, and when we were planning the trip we felt that would have been too long there. In any case, there at least seemed to be things to do in Martinique, not a lot, but a couple of things, and since everything was centred around Fort-de-France, it'd be an easy way to spend 2 days. Yeah, hindsight is a marvellous affliction. The town itself is actually quite nice. It doesn't have quite the charm of Soufrière, being a lot bigger and a lot more functional, but the centre is full of relatively pretty streets and ornate buildings, many with lots of colour. One of the most notable is the Cathedral Saint-Louis, a slightly odd-looking square-panelled building with a large iron steeple and framework that is the 7th iteration of the cathedral in less than 400 years, because Martinique isn't the most environmentally stable place in the world. The nearby Bibliothèque Schultze, one of the first buildings we saw when we left the ferry terminal, was designed in the same way by the same architect, Pierre-Henri Picq, and to be honest, defies categorisation, being a whole mix of styles and colours, complete with a curved pyramid glass dome. In principle, it's quite an easy city to get around too. Our hotel was a standard issue budget type hotel, 3 or 4 miles towards the airport and right next to a large out of town shopping centre, but there were regular buses that plied the route, taking about 20 minutes. I say buses, they were in fact more akin to rail-less trams in style and effect, mostly riding on their own dedicated busway and only stopping at specific bus stops which had platforms. Our main issue with them was working out how to buy a ticket. There wasn't a machine at the stops, and the devices on board didn't seem to be working at all. On our first trip we got off part way just to check that it wasn't a feature of where we boarded, but a quick chat with a couple of the locals going the opposite direction revealed that not only was nothing working, so effectively the buses were free, but they seemed very confused that we'd even asked the question. The website for the local transport authority very much told us travel was not free, and it told us which tickets we needed to be buying, so evidently this was a long-standing technical issue rather than a radical transportation policy decision. We mostly ate at or from the nearby shopping centre. It was a pretty big place and itself contained a large branch of the French supermarket chain Leclerc. And much of the produce sold was made, brewed, produced in France, including their large beer selection. It did mean we got the opportunity to have some decent cheese and bread at French prices, natch, though surprisingly not excessively so given that they had to add shipping costs to everything. Also, on our first night, we ate in a slightly dodgy pizzeria close by the supermarket. While the pizza was mid, the local room they had, Maison La Monnaie, was very nice. And also, the only time I can remember ever having rum that was as transparent as vodka. We were in that hotel because, once again, finding twin-bedded rooms had been an issue. This was one of only about 2 or 3 options in the entire Fort-de-France metro area that were available, regardless of budget, and the others were Airbnbs in obscure parts of the outer city that might have been trickier to get to. It was a decent enough hotel, though, and they were more than happy to forward on a package given to us to transport across international lines by a hotel in Soufriere. I'd love to say this sounds like some kind of clandestine affair, akin to when someone in a suit in a suspiciously quiet restaurant says they're in the import-export business and doesn't clarify. In truth, it was much more mundane, if a little odd. A previous visitor to the hotel in Soufriere lived in Guadeloupe and had left something behind. Earrings, I think, or some kind of jewellery anyway, and when we told the hotel we were headed to Martinique, they'd contacted her to ask if that was of any use to her, and apparently it was. We had initially suggested we post it once we arrived, because domestic mail rates, but as it turns out we didn't get to a post office, so we asked our hotel in Martinique if they could hold on to it until she could pop over from Guadeloupe and collect it in person. And everybody was more than happy to do this. The package was in a plain brown envelope, yes. But I know it was legit, because I saw our hotelier wrap it in front of my very eyes. That was the most exciting thing that happened while we were in Martinique. Not only was our visit over a weekend, it coincided with a designated holiday, Pentecost, on the following Monday, so pretty much everything was closed for much of our time there, and even the most of the local buses and ferries had stopped running by Saturday lunchtime. We couldn't even get to one of the historical sites we'd planned to visit, a local slavery museum, because it's up a hill in the forest on the other side of the bay to Fort-de-France. So without buses and ferries, our only option would have been a 23-kilometre long and expensive taxi ride each way around the bay. Sunday was particularly quiet. Even the shopping centre was closed, and while the buses to and from the airport were still running, it was a much reduced service. The city centre of Fort-de-France on a Sunday was very quiet, and the only place to buy food seemed to be the McDonald's, which, as this is France, doesn't even count for Laura's visit a Mackie D's in every country she visits list. Even the street stalls in the green by the seafront were shuttered. About the only thing we did do on our time there was visit a local history museum, and honestly we really only did that because we were passing it, it was open, and they had aircon. This was the Musée d'Archéologie et de Préhistoire de la Martinique, and it depicted all manner of things to do with pre-colonial life on Martinique, who the people were, where they lived, how they lived, and what they did, including things like fashion and wedding practices. Everything was in French, I must say, but Laura's pretty good at French in general, and I'm okay at reading it, so we got through fine. It was a couple of floors, and we wandered slowly through it, taking maybe an hour. What didn't help was the weather. I don't know if it's because Fort-de-France was the biggest town we'd been to on the trip, or whether or not that having more concrete and cement and tarmac affected things, or whether it's because it was the lack of a refreshing breeze from the sea, or whether it was just something else, but Martinique felt hot. It wasn't any hotter than St. Lucia had been, and it just felt a lot more oppressive and sultry. Maybe it was a reflection of mood. English lit majors, take note. It just meant on the Sunday we had a lot of sitting around on park benches trying to stay in the shade, waiting for our afternoon ferry to Dominica. Hopefully Dominica would be more interesting. Well, you'll find out if it was next time on Travel Tales from Beyond the Brochure, because this trip was far too long to do in one podcast. Until then, don't argue with a pizzeria owner about being shafted €15. It's not worth the hassle. And if you're feeling off colour, keep on getting better. Thank you for listening to this episode of Travel Tales from Beyond the Brochure. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, tell your friends that I rocked your socks. If you wear socks while listening to my pod, that's your call, not mine. And don't forget to leave a review on your podcast site of choice. You can tweet me at RTWBarefoot, and I'm the same name on YouTube, Blue Sky and Pinterest, or you can find me as Barefoot Backpacker on Instagram, Discord and Facebook. Don't forget to sign up for my newsletter, and if you really like what I do, you can slip me the cost of a beer through my Patreon in return for access to rare extra content. Travel Tales from Beyond the Brochure was written, presented, edited and produced by the Barefoot Backpacker. The theme music is Walking Barefoot on Grass Bonus by Kai Engel, which is available via the Free Music Archive and used under the Creative Commons Attribution 4.0 International License. Show notes are available on my website, barefoot-backpacker.com. Until next time, have safe journeys. Bye for now.